recording here. We're going to talk tonight about witness and service. So, this is all about last couple times we've been talking about prayer and holiness, and that's part of our life. I'll talk about it as life in the Holy Spirit. So you'll specifically, when we talked about confirmation, you'll be receiving more graces from the Lord through the gift of the Holy Spirit when we receive confirmation. And so that gives us, if you recall, it gives us extra graces, the power to profess the faith in Christ publicly and, as it were, officially, a stronger resistance to all the assaults of the world, an added strength to protect and defend the faith. You'll have the commission to spread and defend the faith, and share more completely in the mission of Jesus Christ. So a lot of those refer to what we're going to talk about today, of how that we share in Jesus' mission through not only our baptism and confirmation, but our whole Christian life calls us to that. Not just myself as a priest, who's called to bring the sacraments and share the faith, but every single one of us share in that as being witnesses to that. And the sacrament of confirmation gives us special graces to be able to do that, because it's not always easy to be able to, in a sense, publicly share with others the fact that we are Christian. All right. So we'll talk more about that. But it's something that all of us are called to, and it goes all the way back to Jesus and the Great Commission. We receive the faith, we become disciples, not just for ourselves, but we are to bring Jesus to others as well. So Jesus says to the apostles and to us, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you, and behold, I am with you always until the end of the age." So these are Jesus' final words before he ascends back to heaven. So evidently they were quite important, right? They're kind of like his last will and testament. What am I going to say before I leave, right? So we want to pay attention in particular to what he says. So it begins with go, right? That's an imperative motion, right? Go. We are sent. In fact, at the end of every Mass, we hear that repeated. We end with Mass, "Go forth." The Mass is ended, right? Go. You now have everything that you need, all the graces from God, so now go. You're on mission. And that's actually what the term Mass comes from, the Latin word that phrase had. So in English, it's "go forth, the Mass is ended." In Latin, it was "ite missa est." So missa is where Mass comes from, and missa is also the root of the word mission. Right? So we're sent on mission. So every Mass we go to sends us forth on mission at the end of it, just like Jesus sent them on mission here. So who is our mission to? Well, Jesus says, make disciples of all nations, right? So our mission is to everyone. For us particularly, it's whomever we happen to come across in our life, right? So for some people, they might be called to be missionaries in the way that we usually think of the term. And that would be, like let's say they're sent off to some other place, some other country to bring the Lord there. Well, for us, we are missionaries in our own place, right? And so we'll talk more about how we are missionaries. So what is the mission then? So what is our purpose, our goal, for what are we being sent to do? So if we look at what Jesus says, he says to make disciples, right? So to make people into those that follow Jesus, to bring people into a relationship with God. So how do we make disciples? Well, he mentions about bringing them to the sacraments, baptizing them in the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you, right? So they're bringing us in contact with both the Word of God in his words that we find in scriptures and the teachings of the church, but also Jesus present to us through the sacraments as well. So the whole life of the church. That's what we want to bring them in contact to. How can we do this? It can seem kind of intimidating. How could I possibly be asked by Jesus to do this? Well, he doesn't say, "Go do this, bye, I'll see you later." Even though it might feel like that to the apostles, right? Because he ascends to heaven at this point. But he says, and behold, I am with you always until the end of the age, right? I am with you until you're with me in heaven, right? So he doesn't just say, go and do this on your own. I'm going to be with you. And that's really what happens at the end of every Mass, right? Jesus has come to us in Holy Communion. We now are filled with his life and his grace. And now with him within us, we go out to bring him to others. So for us, so this Great Commission, this call to go and make disciples, oftentimes you'll hear it in terms of evangelization. So the evangelium in Latin is a word that means gospel, the good news, right? And so to evangelize means to share the good news, to share Jesus with others. So when you hear the term to evangelize or evangelization, that's basically what it's about. It's about this commission that Jesus sends us to go and bring others to him. And you may hear a term as well called the new evangelization. So this is a term that goes back to St. John Paul II. He wrote, in countries with ancient Christian roots, entire groups of the baptized have lost a living sense of the faith, or even no longer consider themselves members of the church. In this case, what is needed is a new evangelization, or a re-evangelization. So, countries with ancient Christian roots, where many baptized have lost a sense of the faith and no longer consider themselves members of the church. Can you think of any place that might include? The United States? You know, our own country. We're living in a place where we need the new evangelization. And this is everywhere. It's not just in urban areas, as sometimes we might think, but it's out here in the rural areas too. So, you know, that's one of the reasons why we're going through all the journey of faith stuff, is because we've seen these downward trend lines of people participating within the faith, especially those in younger generations, where we have failed in many ways to pass on the faith effectively to the coming generations, right? So these are some pretty disheartening statistics and trend lines. This is the mass. So the top line is the mass attended, or the total number of parishioners that are registered in the 7 parishes of our future 7-parish family. And the orange line is the mass attendance through time. So it starts in the early 2000s, and the projection over the next 10 years to 2032 is that if we follow the trend that we've been on for the past 20 years, if we don't do anything differently, obviously we can't predict the future, but I mean the trend line would lead us to less than 30% attendance at Mass for all Catholic, for those that are even considering themselves to be Catholic, that are registered in the parish. So, in other words, we need to do something different. We need a re-evangelization. And so that's, you'll hear this in terms of why we're being called to grow to be missional parishes. So you hear that term I've talked about before. I noticed just before this, I don't have the data for our counties in this area, but so this was from my previous counties when I put this together. I didn't have time. We have the data for our counties, but I didn't have a chance to get it. So, but you'll notice on here that overall, through time, so yellow is Catholic, red is other religions, and those who consider themselves to be part of no religion, the unaffiliated, or sometimes they're called the nuns because they have no religion. The nuns have steadily increased, whereas those participating in organized religion have decreased. Right? So there's more and more people that live among us who perhaps their parents or grandparents consider themselves to be Catholic or Methodist or Lutheran or something, but more and more now are estranged from the faith entirely. And so we really do need a new evangelization. There's plenty of people that we can share Jesus with. I would say that there's probably plenty of people who may know of Jesus, but don't really know anything about him. Right? That there's plenty of people that are very much uninformed or ill-informed sometimes with regard to what Christianity, what Catholicism is all about. And so that's part of our role, is to go and bring Jesus to them. So evangelization is everything that we do to tell others about the good news of Jesus Christ, right? So anything that we do that goes along those lines. And this is why the church exists. That was the Great Commission, right? Jesus founds the church and gives us this mission. The church exists to evangelize. So in some ways, but one of the ways in which we've kind of not always done that is our parishes sometimes just look to ourselves, especially small rural parishes that over time have kind of deteriorated. There's this kind of, let's just, we want to cling to what we have instead of, which inevitably that just keeps us on the decline, instead of actually going out and inviting other people to join us. So we are to be salt and light. So this is I think I talked about this passage when I talked about marriage, right? I think we talked about salt and light, right? So that salt and light, they don't exist for themselves, but we use salt to season other food. We use salt to, and so as Christians, we are to season the world around us. Salt is used to to melt the ice. So we want to melt those frozen in sin or in despair in our world today. Light too is not just for itself, right? We use light so we can see everything else. So same way, we are to be a light in the darkness for those who may be in darkness, who may not know that there's anything else other than what they've always experienced. Because for us, for those who know Jesus, we know what effect that has in our life. And we may not always realize, for those who don't have that relationship, of what they don't have. So when I was at a previous parish, there was someone who was explaining to us. So he was a convert, and he had been an atheist for basically a large part of his life. And his spouse was able to help him to be able to go through that time of conversion. But the way that he talked about his experience of going from being an atheist to becoming a Catholic, he said, I never knew you could have that much joy. It's like, I just thought the miserable state that I was in was just normal. I thought that's the way you had to be, and it was just that complete transformation. But there's many people that are in darkness. That's literally the image that Jesus uses, right, before he came, right? A people who are in darkness have seen a great light, right? And so he calls us to also be that light. Because even though Jesus has come, there's still many people who don't really know what it's all about. They haven't heard the good news in a way that's really sunk into their soul. So evangelizing, Pope Paul II says in a document completely about evangelization, he said, evangelizing is in fact the grace and vocation proper to the church, her deepest identity. She exists in order to evangelize. So that is what she's all about. And if the church fails to live that out, she kind of becomes irrelevant, which could probably be one of the reasons why she's deteriorated in some parts of the world, where we have forgotten our identity, that this is what we're supposed to be doing as a church. It's not surprising that she's kind of withered away. Jesus, though we have great hope, Jesus said that the gates of hell will never prevail against the church, so it's not as though the church will completely disappear. But he never said that the church would always exist in certain places. In the book of Revelation, the book of Revelation was addressed to several churches in Asia Minor. There are no churches there today. So those communities, and they were warned, they were written and there were warnings to those communities. But evidently they weren't heeded, and so those communities don't exist anymore. So that's the thing, is that, if we want our communities to continue, we need to go and evangelize and to share the good news. So when I say the good news, the gospel, we're supposed to share that. Well, what is the gospel that we're supposed to share? Well, we've been inundated in all of it throughout our course through RCIA, but let's just very quickly, what's the core of the gospel again? What is the good news? Well, the good news begins with a relationship. The good news is that God loves us so much that he made us for relationship with others. But there's bad news. All we have to do is look out in the world around us. that there's so much evil within the world, that sin has ruined our relationship with God and with others around us. And so now we become isolated from one another, from God, and we could be from all eternity if something doesn't happen. And therefore the response from God is that he has come to restore us to the original state, that original relationship that he wanted for us from the very beginning. And he does this through sending his son, Jesus Christ, who does what we weren't able to do, to offer himself perfectly to the Father. And so through his death and his resurrection, Jesus is able to win salvation back for us, right? So he restores us to new life with God. And so that requires our own response. What are we going to do in response to what God has done for us, all the gifts he has done for us? And so our response is to let him be a part of our life, right? To allow that relationship to be. Because, right, every relationship has to, I mean, you might want to have a relationship with somebody, but if they don't let you, you're not going to have a relationship. So that's what our response is to allow God into our life to be able to transform us, right? So this is the short, core of the gospel version. And I would say for every Catholic, every Christian, it doesn't have to be said exactly in this way, and obviously it could be fleshed out more, but do you know how to share the gospel? Do you know the core of the gospel? If somebody asked you, why are you Christian? Or what is Jesus all about? Could you share with them the good news? Do you know how to word it in a way that makes sense to you? All right? So that's going to be our challenge, and my challenge to you is how would I do that? If somebody were to ask, what kind of words, how would I explain it using my own words, right? So this is just one way in which it could be explained, the good news. But to have that kind of ability, that's really where it starts, because we can't give something if we ourselves aren't convinced or don't know how to do it. With regard to this, Pope Francis wrote an encyclical called The Joy of the Gospel, Evangelii Gaudium, so the Gospel of Joy. And so in there he says, in your heart you know that it is not the same to live without him. What you have come to realize, what has helped you to live and given you hope, is what you also need to communicate to others. So, and this is part of the core of the gospel. Not only just being able to say, God loves us so much that he wants a relationship with us. We turned away from him in sin and lost it, but Jesus restored us back to new life, and so now we need to respond. But what the most beautiful way of doing this is to speak from your own experience, right? How has Jesus affected my own life, right? To really ponder that. What kind of impact has he had on my own life, right? How would I be able to tell somebody about what he's done to me, right? I mean, I look back at my own life and my time when I was in college. I mean, I'd always been Catholic and always, go to Mass and do all the things you need to do. But there were very many ways in which I was very selfish, right? And it was all about me. And it was through a lot of my Protestant friends and their excitement of being able to share the gospel with me. Like, they had no problems of being able to share the gospel. And it really affected me, like, what do I believe? And it got me to have to both study more, and also God doesn't just let it be an intellectual endeavor, but he wants your whole self. And so he really began to transform me in ways in which I was really struggling just in my own life with, sin, as well as just, what's my direction and purpose? Where am I supposed to head in my life? What's next for me? This is, after college. And then he really got through to me during times of adoration, where I really met him, for the first time in a significant way through the Eucharist, right? So being able to share your own personal story of how you have grown in relationship with the Lord, that can have huge impact upon when we're trying to share the good news with others, because they can see that authenticity of how this is why it's important to me. And the reality is if it is important to us, we should want to share it with others, right? if we think this is the most important thing, and this has had such a huge impact on me, I want other people to know Jesus the way that I've come, right? The joy of the gospel fills the hearts and lives of all who have encountered him, right? So we're filled with this joy, and so we want to go forth. But Pope Francis in there, as in the beginning of his letter, as he's introducing this, he reflects, he's like, too often for us as Catholics, we walk around as though we've just come out of a funeral. Right? That's how we look. We're always so somber and woe is me, all these things we're dealing with in life. Well, of course nobody wants to join us in church because where's the joy, right? It doesn't mean we have to jump up and down and wave our hands at Mass or anything, but we should be joyful, right? If people come in there and they feel it's all, and sometimes in some rural communities I can pick on the Germans because that's part of my background, right? Sometimes there's the stereotype of they never want to show any of their emotions, right? So it's like, well, we can show, that we're actually happy to be here. So hopefully sometimes we're happy to be here now. So, all right. Let's see. So, how do I evangelize? So I'm telling you that we all need to evangelize. We need to tell Jesus about the gospel. So how do we evangelize? Because if you're like me, you might be imagining something like this. I don't know if you've ever had Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses come to your door and say, hey, let me tell you about Jesus. Or some very interesting stories. When I was in college, I had some Mormon missionaries that had come by and were trying to tell me about, I even got a copy of the Book of Mormon and all things like that. But I think in our conversations, I told them more about Catholicism than they got to tell me about Mormonism. But then there was one other time when I was visiting my sister in Lincoln, and I'm trying to think, was it Mormon again? Yeah, it was Mormon again. And they came up and wanted to share some things, to evangelize us, and at that time I was already an ordained deacon, year before being ordained a priest. And so I was like, I would have loved to have a continued conversation, but I could tell my sister really wasn't interested in that at that time. So, and I didn't want to lead him on too long, so I explained. It's like, I really appreciate, your desire, they have a good example of like actually going out and wanting to share the gospel, but I'm a Catholic deacon, and so I don't want to lead you astray, but and to lead you on into thinking that you have somebody who's going to convert or something. So anyway, but that's one of the things. Is that what evangelization is? Well, that's one way in which evangelization can happen, but it isn't the only way. Right? And it doesn't necessarily mean that when we talk about evangelization as Catholics, that's what we're talking about. Now, there are Catholic versions of this. So, for example, there's different organizations like St. Paul Street Evangelization, where people literally are out on the street and will try to engage people with matters of the faith. So they're trained how to do that and talk to people. I mean, it probably wouldn't be the most effective way to do it in Osmond, right? Because there's probably not, it's not as though Main Street is super busy, where you're going to have a lot of people going through. But like, say, for example, you're down in the Old Market area in Omaha, right? That might be a great place to do some street evangelization because that's an area that people walk around in. So that's, or in larger cities and things like that. Other ones, Legion of Mary is another group. Legion of Mary, one of the things that they do also is home visits, where they will stop at individuals' homes, and it's when I was assisting a group when I was at St. Columkill and Papillion when I was there, and it was a very difficult thing, and so they're starting to do that was to go and visit, or to call up, or to go and visit those that had just joined the parish, right? So that they could reach out and make further connections so that we don't lose. We made this connection but we don't want to, because it's a really big parish, and so we don't want them to become nameless. It's one of the things. So, but it was a challenge for them to do that, right? And it's certainly not something that is the only way in which we're called to evangelize. So, what how is it that how do we evangelize? Well, let's look specifically at the method that Jesus used, right? Because if we want to know how to do things, we should probably look to Jesus, right? He is our model. So let's see what he did. So we could call it something called spiritual multiplication, is the method of Jesus for evangelizing. So what do we mean by that? Well, it'll become clear here in a second. So it begins with Jesus, right? So he comes, and so what does he do? He begins to gather individuals around him. And he starts pretty small, right? He starts with the apostles, and he has 3 of them that are kind of his closest companions, right? So Peter, James, and John, we see those 3 at the most important points. Like, so for example, in a couple weekends, we'll read the Gospel of the Transfiguration. So Jesus took Peter, James, and John up the mountain for his transfiguration. The rest of the apostles were still at the foot of the mountain, right? So Jesus is going to spend particular time with and forming those 3 men, right? So he's going to take particular time with them, right? But he's also going to expand out, not just those 3, but to the rest of the 12, right? So he's going to invest a lot of his time in the 12, while he's also going around and preaching and teaching and everything, right? So it's not as though he's keeping things exclusive to them, but he's going to put a lot of his time and energy forming them and preparing them, right? Of course, then we also read in the Gospels, there is the commissioning of the 72 disciples too, right? Where he sends a larger group to go out specifically on mission. Now, but he doesn't necessarily do this for every single disciple that's been following him until they get to a certain point in their relationship, right? So we see this going, so there's this method here of Jesus to the 3, to the 12, to the 72. And so you can kind of begin to see how evangelization works. Evangelization works really on a one-to-one basis, where you start with Jesus, and he personally is going to be sharing the good news in the life of God with those that are closest to him, right? But then the 12 are then going to assist him in bringing it to the 72, right? And then it's going to assist, the 72 are then going to assist Jesus and the apostles of sharing the good news and bringing it to more people, right? This is how the church grows throughout history. We see this in the early church. So St. Paul, for example, he talks about, as he's talking to Timothy, he says, what you heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to faithful people who will be able to teach others also, right? So he's telling Timothy there, so you got this from me, so now you need to find other disciples to follow after you, and then they themselves will then share this with others, right? So we begin to see this multiplication again. So Paul, in the scriptures, we got Timothy, we got Titus, we got Epaphras that he talks about. And so each of those are then going to have, several individuals that they're going to invest their specific time in, teaching them how to become the term we use now, we use commonly in the Archdiocese now is the missionary disciple. To be a missionary disciple, one who they themselves can now go out and lead others. So if you see, it's not so much as to like, okay, we're going to go and we got to knock on everybody's door and introduce them to Jesus. Instead, it's are there a few people that maybe you already know? Maybe you already have a relationship with them. Maybe they're people at work or that you're already interacting with, and these are individuals that you can walk with to move along the path of following Jesus, right? This is actually much more effective than, say, for example, if we had a bunch of super apostles, right? Because this is sometimes the mistake that people have. It's like, well, the priest will do it all, right? So if we had a really awesome priest, and every single year he could evangelize 10,000 people every year, right? For him, right? The super evangelist. So after the course of 14 years, he will have evangelized 140,000 people, right? But that's actually pretty sad compared to what could spiritual multiplication do? If you start with one, and that one evangelizes 3 others, and each of those 3 evangelize 3 others, and each of those 3 evangelize 3 others, and each of those evangelize 3 others, right? Well, over 14 years, you could evangelize every single person in the Archdiocese. not just every Catholic in the Archdiocese, this is every single person living in the Archdiocese, right? If spiritual multiplication began. Obviously, it starts really, really slow, right? And that's why it can sometimes seem to be difficult or impossible, right? Because you have to start with small numbers. But isn't that what Jesus did? He started with 12 men who felt like they couldn't do anything. And they couldn't. Until they were given the power of the Holy Spirit. And then suddenly, what did the 12 men do? They evangelized the whole known world at the time, right? And so that's precisely what can happen for us now, is that we're called, but it requires everyone's participation, right? In order for that to work, we all have to be part of this evangelization. So, and this brings so much more, it should uplift us all in this. It does for me, because if it's like as a priest thinking about having to evangelize 10,000 people, like we don't have 10,000 people in all 3 of our parishes, and I feel like that's more than I can't reach everybody in all of our communities and all of our towns. You know, I spend half my time driving back and forth, but but it uplifts me. Is like, yeah, the more individuals that are formed to spread the gospel and to share it with other people in our community, I don't have to do it all, right? I support the specific ones that happen to be the ones that are called for me to interact with, but then I go send everybody else out, right, to evangelize. And so when we're thinking about who is it that we should evangelize, we can think in these terms, that like evangelizes like. So you can most easily evangelize someone that you already have some kind of connection with. That's kind of like you, right? Who is the best kind of person to evangelize a farmer? Another farmer. Who's the best person to evangelize a teacher? Another teacher, right? Who's the best person to evangelize the person that's working with you at work? Maybe you, right? So it's whomever have been placed in your life that you can already form some kind of connection with, right? And it could be the case in which, and we'll talk about this, that's where we really begin with evangelization. It doesn't begin with walking up to the stranger and saying, hey, let me tell you about Jesus, right? Instead, it starts with getting to know another person. And slowly over time, once they begin to trust, we grow, and so naturally, as they learn more and more about you, they come to recognize, hey, there's something different about you. What's that all about? Maybe it has something to do with the fact that you talk about Jesus sometimes. Something different about you. So sometimes people, though, with regard to evangelization, they'll say, well, didn't Francis of Assisi say, preach the gospel at all times, and if necessary, use words? So the way I live my life, that's how I evangelize, right? Well, the thing is that we don't really know if that was said by St. Francis of Assisi. It's kind of, it's been attributed to him, let's say. We don't actually know if he actually said that, right? But the reality is that if we look at St. Francis of Assisi, he himself thought it was necessary to use words, right? There was no if about it for him, right? He thought it was necessary to use words. And so, in fact, it was so necessary to use words that he would preach the gospel even if no one is around to listen. Right? That's where these images of St. Francis with loving animals comes from. People often forget the part of this story is that it wasn't that he just loved animals. He actually shared the gospel with the animals. Right? The animals would come and would listen to him preach. So when there was nobody else, maybe he was, part of his practicing for when he's going to, let me share the core of the gospel with you. Right? So if Francis of Assisi felt it necessary to use words and not just the witness of his life, I think that all of us, it's necessary to use words at times, because I would doubt that we are so holy that all someone would have to do is look at you and they can tell that you're Catholic, right? Or tell that, if it's not quite that clear yet, then we probably need to use words at times and to share things about the faith, right? So once again, it's that one-to-one kind of thing. Most often it's not going to be in large groups. I preach, at Mass, but that's to people that are already there at church, right? That's primarily with regard to evangelization, is not just to the people. I mean, I am evangelizing to some degree some of the individuals that need to grow further along in their faith that are already there at Mass, but there's plenty of others that are not there. And that, in fact, I probably am the worst person to evangelize them, because they might be very, very suspicious of, organized religion. They might have heard lots of things about priests, and they don't want anything to do with them at all, right? And so it's other people that are going to be more able to bring them to the Lord. So in reflecting upon this, let's see here. Yeah. Just checking my notes, make sure I talked about everything that I want to talk about. Yes. So something that the Archdiocese had put forth a few years ago, and they're still kind of using it. They've kind of put together a simplified version of this, but I won't go through every single part of this, but something called the thresholds of conversion. Basically what this is to help us think about how people, including ourselves, we go through kind of stages in our relationship with the Lord, right? As we go through our life, hopefully we're following him more in a greater and greater way, right? So look at the beginnings of the threshold of conversions. So at the beginning of someone's potential relationship with the Lord, they might go through a series of steps from pre-trust to trust to curiosity to openness to seeking. So what is the main kind of movement here? So we start with somebody who maybe doesn't have any trust at all, right? Let's say they hear about the Catholic Church and they're suspicious of it, right? They think it's done no good at all, right? They think it's just evil, and maybe they hear about, it teaches all these moral things, but then there's also, the clergy abuse scandal and things like that. So they don't have any kind of trust whatsoever. Maybe they might even have been turned off. But let's say maybe their parents were Catholic, or something had happened, that kind of turned them away, right? And so they don't have any trust whatsoever, right? Can you go up to that kind of person and invite them to Mass? I mean, you could, but they're not going to come because they have no interest in that, right? So that's not where you start, right? Instead, if you notice someone is in that kind of state, you're not going to talk about religion probably at all, at first. You're just going to, interact with them. Maybe a friendship begins to form, but you want to start, you're not going to necessarily invite them to anything. They're not but then maybe, you have somebody who trusts, right? So maybe they have, they have some kind of positive association with the Catholic Church, Maybe they're like, oh yeah, I have fond memories of, when I was growing up, we would go to Mass, or I remember some of the sisters, in the past. But so maybe they have something of a connection, but they're not really. There's no active faith, in that it's not really part of their life currently, right? So that kind of a person, you can talk a little bit more about those kinds of things. In fact, sometimes those kind of people will, when they see me, they might even mention, I used to be Catholic. So that kind of a person, whether they may be pre-trust or trust or something like that, or somewhere around there. And that's the things too, is like when we're looking at this, we're not trying to put people in boxes. We're not trying to be like, you're in this section. We're basically trying to get us to think about individuals as they're somewhere on a spectrum of following the Lord, right? So every single person that exists has been made in God's image and likeness. If they're baptized, they are a beloved. They're an adopted son of God the Father. If they're not yet baptized, they are a potential son or daughter of the Father, right? Because that's what God desires for everybody, right? So that's what we should see, is that every single person, even if it's that person who's an atheist, who is adamantly against the faith, they're on this scale somewhere, which means they can move towards Jesus, right? So we don't despair of anyone, right? Don't determine for God who can be his follower, right? Oh, they're never going to want to follow Jesus. Well, don't decide that for him or for them. Maybe someone's curious, right? Maybe they'll ask questions actively about the faith, but they're not really at a point where they're interested in making any kind of change in their life towards that. But we can work with that, to begin to answer kinds of questions, or maybe someone gets to a point where they're open, right? Maybe there's actually things going on in their life where they want to seek a spiritual change, right? And this can be, to really walk with people in this time, right? So it might be somebody like they're struggling with something, and you might even just share things, and it's like, well, in my own experience, when I've struggled with that, this is what I've found has helped me, right? And you bring something of the faith into that, or just saying, I'll pray for you, or things like that. That's going to be, they're more open to hearing those kinds of things, rather, if they're further down, if you say, I'll pray for you, they might be like, well, don't bother. No. You don't have to tell them you're praying for them. You can just do it anyway. No. But then they get to a point where they're actively seeking, right? So they actually want to know what's going on. So at various different points, the church should have, or individuals as well as parishes, should have various things that can assist people at different points, right? So maybe for people that are earlier on, maybe just certain kind of social type things, that they're, so maybe it's like, the Knights of Columbus had the fish fry, right? And so we get all sorts of people who show up to the fish fry, and maybe throw in a little bit of the faith there just as a kind of seeds. But that's a very different environment than, say, like RCIA, right? Where RCIA is much more on the seeking end, right? You've got individuals that are interested enough, I want to know more about this. So eventually at some point, we want to help lead people to a point where we can make a decision to actually follow Jesus, right? Because he's calling us, and that's what Jesus does, right? He calls them, and then he asks them to make a decision. Though we'll see here that this isn't the end. This is the beginning, really. So when Jesus calls the disciples to follow him, it's not the last time that they're asked to do things. They're asked to follow him in a deeper way. So, but we get to somebody to a decision point. And so we could say that, like, this is when somebody, enters the church, or is baptized, they go through that kind of conversion process. So they begin a new life within the church. But it's certainly not ended. Now we have someone needs to grow in their relationship with the Lord. And they begin as a beginning disciple. And as we begin, our relationship with the Lord is kind of mostly about my own relationship with God. Right? How do I personally grow in relationship with God? Right? And so it's kind of a very beginning. As you keep going further, then you even are willing to make sacrifices in a greater way for your own self. But we want to get to the point where it's not just about oneself, but you're a disciple for other disciples, right? So you get to the point where, all right, now I'm going to take part in Jesus' mission, where now I actually want to go and share and try to bring others to follow Jesus, right? And then finally, when you get to the end, the spiritual, or as you continue, the disciple maker is someone who will make sacrifices, even, maybe even like, it's uncomfortable for me to do this, but maybe I'm going to lead a Live Lent Together small group. I'm not only going to go to one, I'm going to lead one, right? And then you get to a spiritual multiplier where it's like, not only am I going to lead a small group, but I'm going to pay attention to some of the individuals that are in my small group, and I'm going to see, I think they might be good at leading a small group themselves. And so I'm going to invest and try to help them grow so that maybe next year they themselves will be in different groups. I'll have a group, and then they'll have started a new group that they'll invite more people to. Suddenly you've now multiplied who is taking part in the life of faith. Right? And so that's really ultimately what we're trying to do, is to move people along this whole path of conversion. Right? We want them not only to make a decision to follow Jesus, but to grow to be a disciple who brings other people, who can help them. And that's really the whole course of what's going on in the background with our parishes through the pastoral planning. We had something called School of Mission that we had. It's all focused on this kind of thing. That's why we're doing the Live Lent Together. That's kind of back. So if you want to see the part of the big picture behind all of this, this is some of that. It's all about evangelizing and bringing the faith to all those. But in order to do this, of course, you have to show that you care about somebody else's needs. Sometimes we in the church have done things like, one way you could call it is a kind of spiritual vampirism. Which is, so vampires, they live off of somebody else's blood, right? So sometimes our churches, because we feel like they're, kind of dying, we will invite people to take part of our church so that they can help run the parish dinner. Right? So we're kind of like vampires, right? We want you because you're another body to work at stuff, right? And I would say that there's many times some people feel that that's kind of the way that they've been treated, and that will certainly not grow the church. That will make people leave. So we have to make sure that, it's primarily about people's needs, about their spiritual needs, and about whatever kind of physical needs they might have. And we're going to talk about that as the next part here in a little bit. So to kind of summarize this, Pope Francis, in his Joy of the Gospel, he said, "I dream of a missionary impulse capable of transforming everything, so that the church's customs, the ways of doing things, the times and schedules, the language and structures can be suitably channeled for the evangelization of today's world rather than for her self-preservation," right? So the church hasn't grown because we've been trying to preserve ourselves, right? That's one of the struggles through our pastoral planning has been, but we've always done it this way. Yeah, but we're dying. It's not working if we've always done it that way. Obviously we don't change just for the sake of change, but we change with a purpose. We change with a mission, right? And so that's the thing is maybe there's certain ways we've done things that haven't been good, that haven't helped, right? So every parish has to evaluate, where have we been spending our time and energy? Have we been spending time and energy on things that aren't for the mission, right? That have nothing to do with the mission, So a parish might be well, we never have any space, this might be a large parish, say, for example. We never have any space to do any kind of evangelization type things or any kind of catechetical or kind of things because we always have to have bingo, going on. It was well, is that being missional? Is that leading people to Jesus or not? If it isn't, it doesn't necessarily mean that people can't do bingo on their own, but maybe we just can't have that as a priority in our parish facilities, right? Because it's not leading towards the mission. Now, does it mean it couldn't be? Could it be? Perhaps, maybe something like that is a social event that actually helps the people that are not yet trusting of the church, right? That are lower down on the thresholds of conversion. But that's what has to be evaluated, is that if parishes are putting their time and energy into things that are not towards evangelization, then we need to get rid of it and then actually put the energy into things that are evangelization, right? And that's part of the hope with, the structure changes in our pastoral planning that we're doing has to happen because we don't have as many priests. We have many more over time, if you go back 170 years into the history of the diocese, through time, you grow in the number of priests and the number of parishes. You get to a point where we hit the high point, both of the priests and parishes. Priests have gone down. The number of parishes have barely gone down, right? There's a lot less priests, and we've got a lot more small parishes that still exist. And so that's why we have to, have fewer priests serving many parishes. But through all this, we actually have to set up a situation in which the priests can help lead the parishes in evangelization and not just preserving everything. And that's part of the reason why it's not healthy for the future of the church to just say, well, we'll just still have the priest, do a mass at every single location, max his energy level out completely, because now suddenly he has no energy left to do this part, right? And that's really what's been happening, is that priests haven't been able to lead in this area because we've maxed them out in what we thought was the most necessary. Yes, Mass is important, but if we're doing Mass where there's hardly anybody there anyway, because we haven't evangelized the people around us, well then, pretty soon, we're not even going to have Mass anymore. We're not going to have anybody there. Yeah.
How did there's a lot of small communities, small churches.
Yeah.
Did they have to get permission from the Archbishop or whoever to establish a church?
Yes, you had to have permission from the bishop to build a church at that time. So you see, at that time, when a lot of them were being built, you had stations or locations without even church buildings that priests would travel to. So in the before the going back to the late 1800s, you would have priests that would travel to all of these churches. I've been working on some history of the diocese, and I hope to put together a video series coming up. I need to record all my footage and all that. I'm waiting until the snow goes away.
Yeah, May.
Yes. So it may not be for a while, but I do want to do some. I've written my scripts and all that for that. So yeah, I'll hopefully begin to share some of the more of that kind of information
So
as
based
to
on
what
the
it looked like.
number of priests at that time, they felt that yes, a church could be established. in a
Well,
small-
it was not primarily because of the number of priests at the time. It was because of the inability of travel.
Oh,
Right? So travel in the late 1800s, there were no automobiles
yeah,
yet.
it does make sense.
There were no roads yet in a lot of places,
Yeah.
So individuals would have their own stations, but the priest would be, you might show up for mass maybe once a month, and that's when your mass would be, right? So obviously you were exempted from the Sunday obligation because you just simply didn't have a priest there, right? So it was a very different time, but the reality is that so the number of priests we have today, or that we'll have in 10 years, we'll have 81 priests available for our entire archdiocese for serving in parishes in 10 years. That's how many we had in the 1880s, right? And the other thing too is that the number of people that were living in our archdiocese in the rural areas in the 1880s was what we have today too. So the population is back to that time, but our numbers of churches are still up because we haven't closed as many of them. And I'm not saying that we're going to be closing all these churches, but that's why a number of them won't have a Sunday Mass, right? So one of the things we've forgotten is that parishes exist in part for its non-members. We think they're just all about ourselves sometimes, but no, we exist for everybody else. This is true within the theology of the church for me as a priest too. For a pastor is pastor not only of the people who happen to be registered in the parish or happen to show up at Mass on Sunday. I'm actually pastor of every single soul that lives within the area of my churches, right? So, which is really daunting because I'm like, how do I care for all these people, many of which I don't even see, right? And that's where evangelization comes in, right? Is that I need your help, right? To be able to reach those individuals. Because, whether they're those that are the unaffiliated or even those that have a church, but they're going through tumultuous times. Some of our Protestant brothers and sisters, their churches are going through some very difficult times now with breaking apart within their, and, divisions within their own churches, and, some parts of it going the way of the world, and those who don't want to follow that, feeling like they're kind of lost and have no place to go. It's like, well, I can't really walk up to them and be like, hey, you can come to the Catholic Church, you can come to Mass, right? They're not going to they won't listen to me. But if you may be friends with them, right? Catholics may be friends with them, and they might not say yes to like, well, you can come with me, but just to begin to talk with them. I was talking with somebody who was going through this kind of situation, and we before this, we had come to talking a little bit, so, and I have never been pushy about things or like trying to say, hey, you should be Catholic. No, because we're not quite there. We're not at that point yet. Who knows where the Lord will lead this individual? But it was basically we were talking about things, and they were concerned about, some of the things that were happening in their church in that direction. And so, I just gave some of my own, thoughts and insights. And the individual said, well, I really like the way you think, Father. And I just left it at that for that point. I wasn't going to, I could have been like, well, you can hear more of my thoughts on Sunday. No. But it's like, well, at this point, we'll just let it rest. The Lord is beginning to work, and who knows what the future will bring. And that's the thing, too, is we have to realize is that we don't convert people. The Holy Spirit does, right? So we're the instruments, but He's the one who converts people. So that's why this is not a short process, right? We have to invest in people's lives if we want them to meet the Lord, right? But that's what the world's missing today. We're so isolated from each other today. We're missing those in-person relationships, and that's how we have to do it. That's why it's like it's not enough to be like, hey, we're doing this thing, let's put it in the bulletin, or let's just put it on the website or something like that. Those are good supports, but that personal invitation is so important. So, all right. So I mentioned, we exist for those outside the church, including those who may not be really interested in Jesus himself or in the sacraments. But in some cases, it may be that our interaction with them can begin with the works of mercy. We're called to live out the works of mercy too. So this is part of our mission, is not only to evangelize, but to also care for the bodily and spiritual needs of those around us, to care for individuals. This is what we're talking about when in the gospel yesterday for Ash Wednesday, Jesus talks about almsgiving. So almsgiving is not just giving money, but it is the works of mercy. It's taking care of all the needs of those that are in need. Right? So there are 7 corporal works of mercy and 7 spiritual works of mercy. We can find them we can find them in the scriptures. The corporal works of mercy are the clearest listed. We find them here in Matthew 25. Jesus says, "Come to me, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. A stranger, and you welcomed me. Naked, and you clothed me. Ill, and you cared for me. In prison, and you visited me." So Jesus is beginning to list these works of mercy that when we do for others, because that's the question, right? Lord, when did I do this for you? Whatever you did for the least of my brothers, you did for me, right? So when we do these things for our brothers, then we're doing them for Jesus, right? So we're all called to live out the works of mercy. So the first set are the corporal. Corporal is the word that refers to body. So like if you have a corpus of work of literature, it's a body of literature. If you have a corpse, it is a dead body, right? So corporal refers to body. So interestingly, the term corporal, so on the altar, you may notice at Mass, when we're preparing the altar, there's this little white cloth we unfold first before we put the chalice on the altar. That cloth is called a corporal because it represents the cloth. So Jesus' body is going to be placed on it, right? It represents the cloth, that burial cloth, that Jesus' body was wrapped in, right? And so that's the cloth that, and in literally, if like any particle of the host falls off, when we fold it back up, it literally wraps the body of Jesus to ensure that no minuscule particle will be left there upon the altar. So that's why we use the corporal. Anyway, yeah, so little tidbit there. So the works of mercy. Corporal works of mercy are all about the needs of the body. So the works of mercy make sense compared to what our physical needs are. So the first work of mercy is to feed the hungry, because one of our needs is food, right? We need that for our body. To give drink to the thirsty. We need water. We need food and drink. To clothe the naked. We need clothing, right? These are to shelter the homeless. We need shelter, right? So these are all the classic needs, external needs, right, of our body. Our internal needs, food and water. External needs, clothing and shelter. Then we have needs to maintain health in order to live, right? And so that's where visiting the sick comes in. We also have a special need. For some people who've lost their freedom, they need assistance in that area. And so to ransom the captive is going to be a work of mercy. And then finally, even after death, we still show respect to the body. And so that's where to bury the dead comes in, right? So all these works of mercy fit specifically in with all these needs that our body has. So let's look through and kind of flesh out some more these corporal works of mercy. This panel here is called the 7 Works of Mercy. And so each of these panels is one of those 7 corporal works of mercy. And I will have one of these on each of the slides where we talk about it. And the artist, he made it in such a way as he has put Jesus somewhere in every image, hidden there, right? Because whatever you do to the least of my brothers, you do to me, right? So you can find him hidden in there somewhere. So the first one is to feed the hungry. So what is to feed the hungry all about? Well, what ways can we do it? What ways could we feed the hungry? Well, to literally help people with food, right? So we have things like, food banks, food pantries to help those that are in need. We can have soup kitchens, that where people can come and have a meal. We can do various things like, oftentimes it's not just giving them money, because in some cases it may be that they're struggling with, certain addictions, and they may not use the money for what they really need. And so that wouldn't be the most helpful thing for them. So to give them food specifically would be to be more helpful. Helping support those various organizations or apostolates that assist people in need. If we ourselves are not running it ourselves, we can help various ones. So things like, Catholic Relief Services. It could be, it doesn't have to necessarily be the poor. It could be something like helping a family who's lost a loved one by helping with the funeral luncheon, right? You're helping to feed the hungry, even though they have their own meals, but or maybe you bring something to somebody where they're struggling with something, or so you bring a meal to their home during that time, right? That's a way of feeding the poor. Some people have very generously helped to feed the poor, hungry priest. Taking a friend out to lunch, so that maybe it's not just about food, but also, maybe it's that case in which, here's somebody I want to invest my life in and help them grow in the faith, right? So So helping at a fish fry or a pancake breakfast, or, those kinds of things. All sorts of different ways. It's only limited by our creativity, So I'm sure you could probably think of other ones that would fit in this category of feeding. Where is he? Yes. So let's see. Can I move my mouse there? Right there.
I can't even.
So that's him. Yeah. Well, you kind of have to know what he looks like and how the artist has made him look, and then it'll be easier to find him. So he will look the same basically in each of them. So that's where he is. So, to give an example too. So when I was out in the Elgin area, I also served at St. Bonaventure in Rayville. And so they have a set of stained glass windows that are the corporal works of mercy. So this is to feed the hungry. And what they have in there is they have a saint in each of these windows that represents the work of mercy. So in this one we have St. Elizabeth of Hungary, to feed the hungry. No, it just so happens she's from Hungary. No, she was and this is a married saint. She had 3 children. She very much lived a life of prayer and service to the poor, and used her royal position to advance charity towards those in need in the kingdom. So she would set aside a time each day to go take bread to hundreds of poor individuals that were on their land that they were serving over. There's one miracle so oftentimes you'll see her represented by holding bread, but sometimes you'll also see her holding a bouquet of flowers instead of bread, because the miracle story that's told is that that on one of her many trips as she was delivering bread, there was one point where, even though her husband overall supported her thing in that, there was just one point where he's like, "You give like everything we have away." I'm like, "Are you going again to go?" And so he opens her basket, or to look and see. "You taken bread again?" And it was a bunch of roses instead of bread, right? Right. So God had miraculously saved her from. But overall, the reality is her husband Ludwig was overall, supportive of what she was doing. But all right. So the next one is to give drink to the thirsty. For us, water is, as close as the nearest faucet. So, but in some places, it's not that easy to find water, especially in the developing world. It can be dangerous, or difficult to get water. And so, assisting people, through various programs. Catholic Relief Services has a water sanitation program. Assisting with some people actually will go and assist with things like wells and helping people in that area. Any kind of case, oftentimes it can be natural or man-made calamities, wars, and things like that, where we're assisting people. what can we do? I mean, if we can't go there, obviously we could like donate water or, helping those kind of programs. But also to be more cognizant about our own use and how we are utilizing the gifts that God has given us, and we just don't abuse what we have, so we don't overuse things. It can be as simple as bringing water to, I see my neighbor working out, mowing the lawn, right? I know they don't have anybody else to bring them water, so I will go bring them some water, kind of thing. So it can be as simple as that. So we can probably think of other ways in which we can also bring drink to the thirsty. The example, I'm not 100% sure on this because sometimes I can't always tell which saint, and they don't always have record of who it was. I think it's Saint Rosalia. She was a hermitess who was at a cave, and people would come and visit her. And so here we have, this spring at this cave. And so I'm not 100% sure if that's who it is, but we have giving drink to those pilgrims that are coming through the way. So I didn't point out where Jesus was. Did you find him in there?
Yeah.
Okay. So to clothe the naked is the next one. So the normal state of the human person is to be clothed, right? To have clothes. They don't just exist to keep us warm, but they also express and guard our dignity as well, right? So Adam and Eve were naked and without shame in the garden, but once they sinned, now they needed clothes to protect their dignity, right? And so that's what clothes does for us. Not only keeps us protected, but it also protects our dignity. If you think about what they did to Jesus, they stripped him of his garments, right, to humiliate him, upon the cross. And so being stripped of all that we have is similar kind of things, like when, say during the Holocaust too, right? You're going to, the Jews and prisoners are stripped of all that they have, during that time. What can we do? Well, some of us probably have more clothes than we need. And so we could go through and see, do I need all that I have? Are there things that I can give to those that are more in need? Can I donate things to like a, thrift store or clothing drive or, blanket or coat drive or things like that? So those kinds of, to various shelters or, baby blankets for pregnancy help centers or, those kinds of things. Sometimes we collect, sometimes we might collect during Advent, like toys or other items, for families for Christmas. So once again, there's many different ways in which we can do that. The example that we have from the saints is Saint Martin of Tours. So Saint Martin of Tours was a Roman soldier, and he became a catechumen. So he was in RCIA basically, preparing to get baptized, and so as a soldier, he encounters a beggar, and he cuts off part of his military cloak, to give to the beggar. And that night, Martin has a vision in which Jesus appears to him and says, Martin, a mere catechumen, has clothed me, right? Because once again, whatever you do to the least of my brothers, you do to me, right? And so at age 20, Martin he becomes Christian. He decides that at age 20 he no longer has a desire to fight, and he feels called to follow a different mission, right? And so he dedicates his life to Christ. He becomes a priest and later the Bishop of Tours. All right, to shelter the homeless, right? So to literally do that, to actually take a stranger into your home, may be a rather dangerous thing to do. I mean, it certainly could be a case in which it could change somebody's life. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie The Blind Side, about the football player or who becomes a football player, right? So they literally invite in the home. Obviously, it's not necessarily that's what we're asking everybody to do, is to randomly bring somebody into your home. But it could be on the much simpler end, as like, welcoming somebody to the parish, right? Whether it's a visitor or somebody who's new to the parish, of not glaring at them when they happen to sit in your seat, We want to shelter anybody. Who cares which seat we're sitting in? I like things, I like things the way that they are, but if we want more people to be in our parishes, we have to show some hospitality here. It might be things like donating time, working with Habitat for Humanity, or something like that. You literally, if you have talents in that area, you're literally helping build something to help shelter someone. Volunteering at a homeless shelter. Helping those. We have places, residence places like the Bethlehem House in Omaha is for pregnant, expecting mothers. We have, maybe it's the case in which someone needs assistance to escape an abusive spouse, right? And so you can be of assistance to help them to find the shelter that they need, even the temporary first shelter that they need to be able to get out of that situation. We could reflect here also about immigration and the church's teaching. I won't get into it tonight because we'll talk about some of the social issues and other various topics later on, another day. So I won't get into, but suffice to say with regard to the church's teaching with regard to immigration is that the church's teaching doesn't fit the exact political sides that are usually presented with that and other issues. So it would be important for us to investigate and learn more about what does the church actually say in that area and how to help those that, are homeless because they have traveled from where their homes used to be for whatever regions, refugees or other regions. Becoming so it could be, for example, maybe the individual has a physical home, but maybe they're missing elements of what a home is. So maybe it's, children that are in foster care or something like that, where people are assisting and being foster parents. Or maybe it's a case in which you become a mentor to a child, who maybe doesn't have, certain individuals to be those guides for their life, big brothers, big sisters, helping with things with Boys Town, things like, those kinds of things could also fit under sheltering the homeless. So an example that we have, I think, once again, is St. Margaret of Scotland. When they don't always have certain imagery, well, obviously it's a queen or here, but so St. Margaret of Scotland was a queen and a mother of 8, and she once again she was outstanding in her charity towards the poor and especially children and the elderly, and she would clothe when people would come. She would actually, she and her husband would actually personally wash the feet of visitors and those that were traveling and give them places of rest. So then the next one is to visit the sick. So to visit the sick, this is something any of us can do. Anybody can visit the sick, though many of us may not always be eager to go visit somebody who's sick because, well, the person is sick. And maybe we don't, for some people it's like, well, I don't really want to get sick too, even though in most cases you're not probably going to get sick, but in other cases maybe it's like, it's just the awkwardness of I can't make you get better, and so what am I supposed to do? But it's still, it's very important to visit those that are in that state. And maybe it's uncomfortable too, because if we're around somebody else who's sick, it will remind us of our own mortality. It's like, oh, I went and visited this person in the hospital or nursing home. This could be me someday, right? Which hopefully that should motivate us more to go and visit people, because that's one of the saddest things where, when I go and visit somebody in the nursing home and they have no family to come and visit them, or, that was one of the things, like when they were not allowing people to come in to the nursing home, we would push back on that to some of those facilities and be like, hey, you need to let us come in and visit our people. And the reality is it would be, there's no statistic, but how many individuals, say during the time of the pandemic, how many individuals in the nursing home died not from any kind of actual other illness other than their own physical condition, but partly because they were isolated from everyone, right? My grandmother, who's in her upper 90s now, during that time, when my aunts and uncles and she has 11 children, and they were like, well, we don't know if we want to come because we don't want to spread it to you. She's like, no, you're not going to give it to me. Come. It's like, I don't know how much time I have left on this earth. I want to see you. That's more important, right? So that's one of the things we sometimes will forget, or for those working with individuals in healthcare system, is they do wonderful things in that area, but they may not always think about the spiritual part of that, right? That the care of their soul is just as important as the care of their body, right? So that's why visiting the sick is so important, even if we don't have the ability to actually heal somebody. Obviously, those working in the healthcare industry, they've got this opportunity to do this work of mercy all the time, right? And so hopefully they can, Catholics working in the area can see it that way, right? That's what this is the one of the, so with all these works of mercy, it doesn't mean that every single day we're doing every single work, right? But for those who happen to work in that area or, at certain times, this is what we're called to do at this time, right? But we should be open to doing some version of any of these at any point. So yeah, spending time volunteering in a nursing home, visiting individuals, like for example, we might go and, I think they've done those kinds of things here in the past with the kids in the school where they go over to the hospital and like sing songs or things like that, right? Yeah, so that's doing the work of mercy. They're like that. Visiting one's grandparents or elderly parents, that's a work of mercy, to go and visit them, stopping, checking on the elderly neighbor, make sure they're doing okay. That's one of the great things about small towns is that, so-and-so wasn't at Mass. We better go check and see what's going on, right? So people keeping track and speaking of that too, people are concerned about, well, if a parish doesn't have Mass in that town, how are our older members in our communities going to get to Mass? Well, it's like, well, one of these works of mercy can be to assist them to be able to do that, right? For those that are still able, but they just need somebody else to give them a ride, right? We should be able to do that in our small communities. If we claim that we're as close-knit and small communities as we are, we should be able to do those things, all right? We don't have an excuse like in the big city. So helping assist caregivers, right? Because taking care of the sick is not easy, and it can weigh on somebody who has to be a caregiver. And so, maybe it's like, hey, can I be of assistance, and maybe you can have some time away and just take a break for a little bit, and because sometimes they feel like I can't leave the person I'm caring for at all, So that could be a way of assisting. Let's see. Those we talked about when we were talking about the anointing of the sick. Only the priest can do the anointing of the sick. So, like for example, you visit somebody who's sick and they want a priest to visit, to let me know, because as priests we don't always know who is where, and if they're in the hospital they literally won't tell us unless the person is specifically asking. Become an extraordinary minister of Holy Communion. So if one is an extraordinary minister, you can be trained to go and bring communion. So I talked about that, how they're sent off at the end of Mass to go do that. One potential way of doing this too might be, we have our parish mission that's coming up. That's going to be, the first on the March 19th, 20th, and 21st. And so maybe it's some of our older individuals would like to go to the various nights, but they don't feel comfortable going all the way up to Newcastle the first night, or so maybe being able to get together and help people to be able to come.
So Father, that mission, is it one night that builds on the other night, or is it the same information?
It will be three different talks. You'll get something out of it even if you're not at one of the first ones, but yeah, each of them are different.
Okay.
Yeah, so we would invite everybody to come to as many as they would be able to. And the thing is, you'll get to, it's kind of like, think of it in terms of, I'll have to preach about it as we get closer and a lot of our pieces are all nailed down. But you can also think of it in terms of a pilgrimage too, if we're like, but that's so far away. Well, think of it in terms of, we're going on pilgrimage to this other church site, right? So don't think of it as, I just got to go drive a long ways. But it's like, we're doing it for a spiritual purpose, and therefore it becomes a pilgrimage. So The example of to visit the sick that we have are Saints Cosmas and Damian, who were brothers from Arabia who were the eminent doctors of their day. Like they were some of the best doctors. And they were Christian, and so they never took money for their services for the poor. So they would care for the poor, and they end up suffering martyrdom under Emperor Diocletian during that time. So ransom the captive. So to ransom the captive. So sometimes this is referred to also to visit the imprisoned, because in some cases, if you're visiting somebody in prison, you don't have the ability to actually release them. But that's actually too limited of a phrase. The more fuller way of understanding this one is to ransom the captive, right? Which speaks of a kind of freeing, right? But it may not be our ability to actually physically free somebody, but there's other ways in which individuals who are incarcerated are often imprisoned, right? So they may be imprisoned also with what's going on within them, what maybe led them to do whatever crime that they committed that led them to be where they're at, right? And so internally they're also imprisoned, and so to assist somebody to be able to maybe go through forgiveness, to forgive others that they feel have harmed them, or to receive forgiveness for the things that they themselves have done. Because this is what Jesus came to do for us, right? He came to ransom the captive. We're captive in our sins. He came to ransom us, to free us from sin and death. And so that's what this mercy is for too, is to help free someone. So that's why you'll see, like for example, Pope Francis would go and visit those in prison, because those that are in prison, they may have done a bad thing, but they are made in God's image and likeness, right? Even the worst crime that they may have committed, even if they murdered somebody else, and so they may have forfeited their ability to be free, to move about freely in the world, they are still meant to be a child of God, right? And so we don't want to, God never gave up on us after we sinned. And so we don't want to give up on anybody, too. I mean, this is part of the reason why the church over time has, with regard to, I don't want to get too much into the church's teaching on capital punishment. We might talk about that when we talk about things like immigration. But that's part of the reason why is the church wants to be able to help free those that are captive, even if it means they never are actually able to leave where they're at, right? And so we have individuals, and sometimes it's just, I don't know, to the extent of, there are actually prison ministries where individuals that, from parishes or where you receive the permission or authority to be able to go and actually visit those in, a county jail or something like that. And so to get the process to be able to go and do that. Most of us can't just walk in off the street and say, hey, I want to randomly visit whoever's in prison. Probably, I would guess you probably can't do that. But, supporting individuals, praying for those. St. Therese of Lisieux, when she learned of a criminal who was sentenced to death, she decided to pray for his conversion. So even though she would never see him personally because she was there in the convent, she was still could intercede for his behalf. So even if somebody has done terrible things, and they still have a kind of a dignity that we want to care for them. Maybe it's mentoring, especially teens or youth that have gotten into bad trouble, right? And we don't want them to stay in that situation their entire life, and so we want to be able to give them a chance to be able to have guidance, because maybe that's how they got in trouble, is they didn't have a father figure or someone to help guide them through the difficulties of youth. Recognition that in some ways slavery is still happening, through things like human trafficking and stuff like that, and to recognize, well, how do we, sometimes it's things we can do specifically for them, but sometimes they're these kind of big picture ones that, what is it that I can do, individually, within my communities rather than just, sometimes this case is supporting certain organizations that can help with the bigger picture things. But, sometimes I think in our social media age, people get stuck on, well, if I just say this thing is bad out there on social media, then I've done my duty and I've solved the problem. Well, no, you really haven't done pretty much anything towards it. You should probably start with your neighbor, and not just in general. Yes, helping people, get freedom from sin. To ransom the captive is represented by Saint Sebastian. Probably you would usually see him, he's the saint where you often see him stuck with arrows. So that was one of the ways in which they tried to martyr him. But prior to his martyrdom, he was a Roman soldier as part of the Praetorian Guard for the emperor. And so he actually, when he himself was Christian, he would visit Christians that had been imprisoned until they found out that he himself was Christian, therefore. And so then they ended up martyring him. So he didn't die from the arrows. He survived that, and then he was beaten to death afterwards. So, yeah. But Saint Sebastian. So, and finally, we'll finish up here, and we'll pick up on the spiritual works of mercy next time. But the last corporal work of mercy is to bury the dead. Right? So, some people in the modern world might think this is a really weird work of mercy because it's like, you're dead. What do you need? You don't need anything anymore. There's no need there after that point. But the body is not just a random container for the soul. Our body is ourself, right? We will rise with a resurrected body. It will be the same body, only glorified, united with our soul. And so we care for the body, and we bury the dead to show dignity to the whole of the human person there, because we know they're going to be reunited in heaven.
That one scripture where Jesus said, "Follow me," and he had lost his father, and he said to him, "Leave him for."
Oh, let the dead bury the dead.
Let the dead bury the dead.
Yeah. So how does that fit in? How does that fit in?
In a way, he was
Yeah.
saying, "No, you don't need to bury the dead.
Because so this is for those that are following the Lord already, right?
Uh-huh.
So this is a work of mercy. If you're going to be my disciple, you need to do these works of mercy for others. In that context where he was saying that, is the person was using that as an excuse not to follow Jesus. Right? He was saying, I can't follow you because I have to stick around with my father, and so just like, no, you can't use that as an excuse not to follow me. Like, even if there's something that's good, right, burying the dead, you can't use that as an excuse not to follow the Lord, right? Because sometimes we get into that trap in our modern age where we have a lot of people that, these works of mercy, they're like, yeah, we need to do this, we need to help the poor, we need to do this, but all they are, but they have nothing to do with God, right? And so they just as a church, we can't become just a charitable organization and throw Jesus out of it. Because for some Catholic organizations, that's the mistake they made, right? Is that we're going to serve other people, but we're never going to talk about Jesus. And in fact, some people will even be like, well, our prayer is our work. We're doing this, so therefore we don't actually have to pray because this is our prayer. It's like, that's a mistake. So does that kind of help you understand why he would say that and why there's no contradiction here to bury the dead. So we're honoring the dead. We just don't throw people's bodies in the garbage or anything like that. That's why the church has some of the things that we talked about when we talked about, we don't do scattering of ashes, and we don't do some of the weird things that, we don't, separate ashes into various urns and keep them on our mantelplate piece, or we don't make jewelry out of people's. Yeah. So anyway, we don't do all those things because it's a body, and we respect the human person. So what's some ways in which we can do that? Well, as people get older, we always encourage them to do some kind of pre-planning. That's a kind of mercy towards one's family, because it's a hard time when someone dies and the family has to take care if nothing has been planned yet, right? So they don't know what your wishes are or anything like that. So that can be a good way of doing that kind of mercy. Attending funerals and wakes is really important, right? It's really good in small towns when you've got lots of people from the community will come to the wake or the funeral, right? Even if you don't really know that person, right? You know they were in the community. Maybe you didn't really have any relationship with them, but you come anyway. That's a great thing when people do that. It's really neat in rural communities that funerals and wakes will often be more crowded than the ones in large parishes in the city, because in a large parish in the city, many people can end up becoming anonymous. And so when a funeral happens, it's the immediate family, and sometimes that's it. You don't have anybody else. But this is a work of mercy, that even if you don't really know them, you go. I mean, for us as priests, this is a very important thing. I think some people may have seen this recently. When a priest or a priest's parent dies, other priests come to that, right? We try as best we can. So there was we had a funeral in Randolph that I was scheduled to do, and ended up that a brother priest's mother passed away, and so I wanted to be able to go, and he's in my priest group. So I was like, I want to go to his mother's funeral, and so we were able to work it so that, Deacon Doug was going to preach that funeral anyway, and so it worked out. But then, we had, Father Dave Korth's stepfather pass away, and so notice there were several priests there as well. And afterwards, somebody asked, well, Father, what do we need to do in order to have that many priests at our funeral? I'm like, here's how this happens. You have to give back to God a son as a priest, and then you will have many priests at your funeral. It is worked into the pastoral plan itself as a priority for priests to be able to go and attend the funerals of priests and priest parents, right? So that's something we do. I don't necessarily get to all the ones that happen in Omaha, but I'll try to go, and even if I don't even know their parents much, we still go because they're our brothers, and eventually we will have a time in which we don't have a family to come to our funeral. We don't have a biological family to come to our funeral. And one of the saddest things that really points out some of the difficulties in the church is if you go to a priest's funeral, one of the most beautiful things is you go to a priest's funeral and it's so packed because the faithful are there and the priests are there. But if you go to a funeral and all you find are priests, and very few people actually come to the priest's funeral, right? That's a pretty sad thing. It's like, did they not care about their priests? Even if maybe he wasn't your favorite, you didn't like the guy, no. It's a work of mercy to go, But it could be, even before helping at funeral luncheons, helping make food for those who've lost a loved one, sending a card to somebody who's lost a loved one. Maybe it's a card year after or something like that, right? Because it's not as though they're going to forget, and everybody else goes back to their normal life, except for those who have lost someone they've loved, and their life never is the same again. Visiting the cemetery, going and praying for those who have died at cemeteries, especially the church, reminds us to do that during November, but we can go at any time. That's part of the reason why we also have cemeteries, in fact, too, right? So there's an actual place there to go and remember the loved one as part of that. There's different groups, for those who maybe lose a child before they're born, through miscarriage, and to help support one another, because sometimes that's a sorrow that sometimes remains hidden, that people will carry. I've kept you long, and so I better stop. Last to bury the dead, Saint Cecilia, I think. Saint Cecilia is our patroness of the Archdiocese of Omaha. Probably most would know her for being the patron saint of music. So she's often shown with a musical instrument. But part of her story too is that of her being buried in the catacombs. So we can see here a saint being buried in the catacombs. So I think that's who that is. I'm not 100% sure, but All right, so then next time we'll look at the second half of the works of mercy. We'll look at the spiritual works, because we're both body and soul. So we also got to take care of the needs of our soul too. So, all right.